What would you do if you discovered that the car you bet all your season is broken from its design? What if that finding is revealed by your star pilot just before the Azerbaijan Grand Prix? Today we tell you why Vasseur is more worried than ever. It all started like any other week before a race. The calendar marked an appointment in Baku, but in Maranello, the atmosphere had already been loaded with tension. Ferrari had an eye on the Azerbaijan Grand Prix as the turning point, not only because of the speed of the urban circuit or for the strategic opportunities it offers. The important thing was what was coming. A key update. The new aerodynamic soil of the SF25. A piece designed with the hope of balance the car, correct its vices and finally release its hidden potential. But that potential never came. In Maranello's simulation facilities, Lewis Hamilton prepared for another technical day. Since the beginning of his adventure with Ferrari, the British had adopted a meticulous attitude, thoroughly getting into work with engineers. He was not simply a pilot. It was a clinical examiner, someone who dissects the car to the last screw. And that was precisely that made it the catalyst for a devastating revelation. The engineers, instead of finding a pattern that led to a solution, ran into a series of contradictory symptoms. The SF25 did not suffer from a bad adjustment. He had a birth anomaly. Each parameter analyzed from the rear suspension to the cooling system revealed a critical deviation regarding the original design objectives. There was no longer talking about execution errors, but of a poorly raised architecture from the very concept of the car. If the initial discovery was a shock for engineers, what came later was an immersion to the disaster's core. Because SF25 is not simply a difficult car to drive. It is a technical enigma whose complexity has even cheated the most advanced simulation systems that Ferrari has in Maranello. The failures were subtle, elusive, disguised under behavior patterns that could be interpreted at first as a product of the setting, piloting style, or even the weather. But the simulations did not lie. The data, reviewed line per line, began to draw a technical map full of red areas, inconsistencies, and contradictions. What seemed before disconnection was now revealed as evidence. One of the most serious problems arose in the rear axle, progressive loss of adhesion as the tires reached normal career temperatures. But it was not a common fall due to overheating. It was a kind of decomposition of car behavior. As the rear compounds approached their operational range, the SF25 began to oscillate. Small lateral movements, apparently imperceptible to the outer eye, which forced the pilot to correct with constant micro-adjusts. That need to be correcting all the time destabilized the car in full curve, causing not only loss of rhythm, but a physical and mental tension that eroded each stint. This is not something that an engineer can solve on the track, or something that a pilot can simply adapt to tolerate. It is an unwanted characteristic integrated into the chassis. And the most alarming, there is no way to eliminate it without redesigned structural components. Another critical focus was the brake cooling system. A fundamental piece in the thermal equilibrium of any Formula One car, but especially delicate in a season where the tire operation window has narrowed even more. In the SF25, the thermal flow to the rear brakes is poorly distributed. In normal situations, brakes help stabilize the temperature of the rear wheels, but the opposite occurs here. Calipers cause localized heat peaks that distort the internal pressure of the tire. This not only alters the rhythm in the race, but it breaks the symmetry of the car's behavior between the front and rear train. For the pilots, this translates into a double personality sensation. In some curves the car enters well, it decomposes without prior notice. And the worst, the variation occurs between turns. A car that never offers the same answer is impossible to dominate, no matter how talented you have behind the wheel. But perhaps the most unforgivable error is in the data correlation. Ferrari, for months, has worked under a wrong hypothesis. CFD simulation tools, wind tunnel, predictive software were offering aligned responses with a model that did not reflect reality. That is, the SF25 was developed and adjusted under a technical logic that simply does not exist on the track. This divorce between the virtual and the real is one of the worst nightmares for a Formula One, because not only prevents you from finding solutions, but makes you make erroneous decisions with full security. A technical mirage that costs tenths, points, and, eventually, championships. The car not only was not competitive, it was based on a technical lie. And that kind of problem is not fixed by changing ailerons. It crawls, multiplies, suffers. While Hamilton and Leclerc continued to demand each weekend, their engineers already knew they were competing with a broken weapon. At that time, the problem ceased to be performance. He became philosophical. Does it make sense to continue investing resources in something that is convicted since its conception? And there was still the hardest to assume. The update package prepared for Azerbaijan, including a new flat background and aerodynamic improvements, would not have any real impact if the foundations of the car are compromised. How to put new paint on a wall with cracked foundations. Thus, the SF25 went from being a competitive promise to becoming a technical load. A problem that is not seen from the outside, but that devours from within. Making this decision was not simply a reaction to technical frustration. It was an act of brutal honesty. Vasseur understood that continuing to invest in the SF25 was like continuing to paint a facade while the building falls apart inside. The car could not be saved with incremental improvements. He had failed fundamentally, his architecture. It was a machine with a broken design. And any improvement would be absorbed by an unstable base, as if the car rejected any healing attempt. That conclusion has a huge weight for any director, but even more for Vasseur, who had built his long-term strategic plan with Lewis Hamilton as pillar. The signing of 7-times champion was not a media play. It was a commitment to redefine Ferrari's culture. With Hamilton came the methodology, the demand, the discipline of a champion forged in years of domain with Mercedes. And now, all that human capital crashed into an invisible wall, the failed design of its own weapon. For Vasseur, keeping the course would have been easier. Introduce the pieces in Baku, declare that there was still a margin of improvement, and maintain the progress narrative. But it would have been a lie. And in Formula One, technical lies slowly destroy you. They take away points, credibility, key personnel, and finally, pilots. The cancellation of the technical package was not just a break on development. It was an internal signal. A clear message: we are going to redesign from the base. No more patches. No more illusions. And for Hamilton, this meant the recognition that his arrival would not change everything overnight. Despite his talent, his experience, and his ability to detect failures before anyone else, he could not save a project condemned by his own structure. Internal, this decision divided the team. Some departments, especially aerodynamics, felt frustrated, even betrayed. Months of discarded work. An investment of hours of simulation, tests, and design, abandoned with a single internal mail. But those who understood the magnitude of the problem knew that this was the only dignified exit. Stop, understand, and redirect before sinking completely. The most important thing is that this decision comes with a political cost. Because in Ferrari, every decision is judged not only for its effects, but for the image it projects. And publicly declare that the development of a car is cancelled in full season is almost a taboo. In the halls of Maranello, it is already beginning to speak of the SF25, but of the bankrupt 25, and the urgent need to launch the 2026 project long earlier than expected. This raises an uncomfortable but inevitable question. Should Ferrari completely abandon the 2025 season and focus on the following year? Does it make sense to continue competing for isolated points when the war is already lost? Vasseur knows it. The immediate future will not be kind. The next races could become a calvary, with McLaren and Red Bull increasingly further, and Mercedes recovering land. But he also knows that a real change is only possible when reality is accepted, however raw it is. And this, without a doubt, is the season where Ferrari has had to look in the mirror and recognize that the problem was not only in the results, but in the very heart of the car. The history of the SF25 is no longer that of a competitive car that seeks improvements to fight for victories. It is the story of a disappointment built with carbon fiber and misunderstood data. It is the story of a legendary team facing the worst of the diagnoses, a silent but structural error, one that is not revealed with a red flag or smoke out of the car. It manifests itself in small inconsistencies, in pilots distrusting the rear train, in strategies that never end up working, and above all, in the impotence of a team that fails to understand why it loses when everything seems to be in its place. And for Vasseur, the question is even more sharp. To what extent can a project be sustained when the foundations are compromised? How long does Formula One give you before I leave behind? But perhaps the most uncomfortable question is the one we become fans. How many more years can Ferrari continue to be wrong? Because in this sport it is not enough to have history, passion, or talent. It takes precision, innovation, and an almost surgical capacity to detect errors before they become irreparable cracks. And this is where I want you to enter. Do you think Ferrari should be lost this season and concentrate from already in the development of the 2026 car? Or do you think you can still rescue something with specific adjustments? What role should Hamilton play in all this? Is it the man who can lead this reconstruction, or will he be a victim of another era of Maranello? Leave it to the comments. I want to know how you see it, because what happens in Ferrari today could define the entire next decade of Formula One.